Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in criminal law. We're going to continue to talk about various different homicide offences in this lesson, focusing on the idea of gross negligence manslaughter. So we've been spending some time over the last few lessons talking about the different kinds of manslaughter being mainly described as voluntary manslaughter. So, for example, we looked in the previous lessons at the concept of voluntary manslaughter by way of diminished responsibility. And then we also looked at voluntary manslaughter through the concept of the loss of control. We then start to talk about involuntary manslaughter and described one known as constructive manslaughter or unlawful act manslaughter, where you essentially have an already existing offence that is committed, but that is the offence that you use to construct a further offence, i.e. the offence of manslaughter on top of, essentially. This lesson is going to talk about the final of the main manslaughter offences. We're going to focus on the concept of manslaughter by way of gross negligence. Gross negligence manslaughter is a kind of voluntary manslaughter, or an involuntary manslaughter, should I say, which pertains specifically to the negligence of an act or an omission. And with that in mind, you should be able to essentially make some comparisons, at least in terms of the components of negligence, from your studies in the law of tort. So those of you who have studied tort at the same time as studying crime, which is most people, or have studied tort previously to studying crime, will know that one of the major elements of the law of tort is the tort of negligence, and some of the components in negligence in that particular area of the law is quite similar to the area of the law where we talk about gross negligence manslaughter. What it does and what it requires for somebody to be shown to have committed gross negligence manslaughter is firstly for a homicide to take place, so there has to be the death of a victim, and for this death to be attributable to the conduct of the defendant. The defendant must have a duty of care towards that victim, in essentially keeping that victim alive. Again, making some comparisons between this and the law of tort, the concept of negligence within the law of tort. And in addition to that, assuming that you can establish a duty of care, that duty must have been breached in relation to the defendant's acts or the defendant's omissions. Now, the key leading case for gross negligence manslaughter, at least when we talk about the jurisdiction of England and Wales, is the case of Adamako from 1995. Now, the facts of this case are relatively simple to understand. The defendant in this case, the individual who was charged with gross negligence manslaughter, was an anaesthetist who had made a mistake in accordance with an operation and in the process of the operation taking place. The operation itself was actually a very straightforward eye operation, and so there was a very little risk of death to the patient in an ordinary sense of the operation itself. It wasn't like an incredibly complicated, evasive operation. It was relatively straightforward, a relatively easy operation to deal with. Now, the breathing machine that the patient was using to breathe while they were essentially under anaesthetic had become detached from the patient, so it was no longer operating correctly and no longer actually feeding the patient with oxygen. The anaesthetist should have noticed this mistake. It should have been relatively obvious to an individual who had such a duty of care, who was trained as an anaesthetist, to be able to notice that the breathing machine, the breathing apparatus, had become detached from the patient. Even though this should have been relatively menial and simple to mistake, it took them a whole 9 minutes to do so. And so as a result of which the patient would die in the on the operation table. And it was made very clear by the court that where there exists a duty of care, like in the case of the anaesthetist who has an established duty of care towards the patient, criminal liability can arise from a breach of that duty either by an act or an omission. In this case, it was a failure to act in a way that would have been within an accordance with the basic standard of care for an individual of this particular caliber, essentially. So, when we talk about negligence in the context of the criminal law, We are talking about it with some similarities to that of the law of tort. So there is this existence of a duty of care, and there is this breach of a duty of care, which is really the general gold standard, if you will, for what constitutes a negligence case. But when we talk about it in relation to criminal liability, it is an issue that requires more than a just mere trivial amount of negligence. Hence, we don't call this negligence manslaughter. It is called gross negligence manslaughter. This is something that was established in the case of Andrews versus the Director of Public Prosecutions from 1937. In addition to this, since the case of Bateman from 1925, the question of whether or not negligence existed such that it merits a charge of gross negligence manslaughter, so whether or not the level of negligence rises and meets the level of criminal liability for the purposes of manslaughter cases, is actually a question for the jury. It's a question of fact. It's an evidential standard that is going to have to be answered by a jury. And this places quite a lot of responsibility on that of the jury in gross negligence cases, because essentially the jury is able to decide the extent of criminal liability in any given situation. Now, one of the questions that you may want to ask in relation to the criminal law is whether or not this is an acceptable metric, and does this not risk a situation where we create an uncertainty in the law for cases of gross negligence manslaughter and lead to certain circumstances where there are potentially rule of law violations or potentially breaches within the general concept of legal certainty, which is established by basic understanding of the rule of law. If it is up to a jury to decide the extent of criminal liability, then an individual jury on any different case may come up with a number of different answers depending on the metrics that they are examining. So a different jury, for example, on a different day, when given the evidence as to the extent to which the kind of negligence crosses over the threshold to meet gross negligence manslaughter standards, is something of a subjective decision, because a different jury might come to a different conclusion. This is one of the problems that you may come and be faced with when it comes to the concept of gross negligence manslaughter. The law is now made a few slight changes to this issue, and so it represents something of an encroachment on the role of the jury in these cases. So the question for the jury now pertains to whether there is gross negligence once it has been concluded that the negligent act or omission was the cause of the death. This is relatively more satisfying, if you will, because essentially what this is doing is it is essentially laying a bit more of a groundwork before the jury has asked the question and is asked to consider the question as to whether or not the kind of action or omission can rise to the standard of being gross negligence. So essentially, before the issue of whether or not gross negligence has existed, that is only pertained after it has been shown that the negligent action or the negligent omission was the cause of death itself. And then we can come to the conclusion that, okay, that this was the cause of death itself, that it was negligence that caused this individual's death, but does this negligence simply give rise to criminal liability in the case of tort? Or could it give rise to criminal liability if it meets such a standard as to essentially cross into gross negligence? Now, a case that we looked at in previous lessons when we talked about omissions is the case of Crown versus Browon. Now, this is from 2020, so it's a relatively recent case, and it's a relatively high-profile case as well. And this talks about the concept of gross negligence. And you can see by looking at the facts of this case really what the standard of gross negligence looks like. So in this case, Mr. Browon, the defendant, was a rapper who had supplied his girlfriend with some Class A drugs while they were both at a music festival. Now, in addition to the supplying of the Class A drugs, the defendant had claimed to have altered the drugs to potentially increase their effects. Now, the medical evidence and or the testimony didn't actually give any specific details as to what the things that the defendant did to the drugs to actually alter them, but there was just the claim that the drugs had been altered. the question of whether or not they had been altered was essentially something more of a a contextual question, more so than actually giving rise to criminal liability, given the fact that liability in this case arises out of an omission more so than the act. The victim the victim being the girlfriend of the defendant, then began to take an adverse reaction to the drugs. Now, the reason why the issue of whether or not the drugs was altered could have been important, because it might have given rise to this adverse reaction to the drugs, but we don't know. People who are supplied ordinary drugs can also have adverse reactions to them. People can have menial reactions to any kind of substance in reality. Now, when they began to take the drugs and have an adverse reaction to them, the defendant didn't actually alert the relevant authorities or even call for help. So it was very clear that the victim was in distress, and the victim was potentially in a position where they were going to die, but the defendant didn't do anything about it. Instead, what he did was film the victim and then spoke to her parents about what was happening. Quite a troublesome situation. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting here, and really where liability arises for this case, because we're talking about an omission in this case, because he failed to act in a particular way to call for help, was that according to expert medical testimony in the trial, it suggested that if the defendant had gotten the victim seen to at an earlier point, there was a specific time at which the medical expert suggested, there may have been upwards of a 90% chance that the victim would have survived. So it wasn't like they took an adverse reaction to the drugs, and it was at that point at which the victim was essentially her fate was sealed, because it could have been the case that the defendant could have called for help, and that would have led to a potentially 90% chance that the victim would have survived, according to medical testimony. And so, given all of these facts, you can clearly understand why the courts come to the conclusion and why the defendant was convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. And this was gross negligence in the case of the omission. He had failed to act in the circumstances in a way that would have been reasonable. Okay, the standard in this case related to whether or not the danger was immediately apparent, striking, and glaring. So this is quite a higher standard than that of ordinary negligence cases for the law of tort, for example, but it makes sense because we're talking about gross negligence. So it's quite a high standard of negligence. You have to have acted particularly negligently to the extent to which the danger was, quote, immediately apparent, striking, and glaring. And that's sort of the general standard that you can see when we talk about gross negligence manslaughter cases.